Ahmed, who is a historian in the United States. And this is how he described it. He said, at the dawn of the 15th century, Spanish conquerors and priests presented the Indians they encountered with a choice. Either give up your religion and culture and land and independence, swearing allegiance as vassals to the Catholic Church and the Spanish crown, or suffer, and he quotes, all the mischief and damage, unquote, that the European invaders choose to inflict upon you. And I've given a ballpark figure there, but I mean, the breakdown of the figures is really huge. I mean, 11 million people lost their lives in Mexico. The Andean Empire of the Incas, you had 8 million Native Americans lost their lives. The Portuguese conquest in north of Mexico took 2.5 million lives, and the list goes on and on. 50 million is probably the most reliable figure. 100 million is slightly more speculative. Now moving to another continent, I focused on the impact of the slave trade. Now obviously the slave trade did exist in Africa before the Europeans went there, but it didn't exist on the systematic and global scale which it came to once the Europeans basically took control of the coastal areas of Africa and began shipping out dozens and dozens and dozens of Africans day by day. This really lasted it was a protracted period over 5 centuries. And there's a lot of debate over how many people actually died in this process. But R.J. Rummel, is one of these scholars who has this penchant, this deep passion for statistics. If you look at his book, Death by Government, it's literally just a compendium of statistics of governments that have basically killed people. And it's a really, really harrowing read, but he's very, very meticulous. And that's his estimate, that in 5 centuries, you had a minimum of 17 million Africans dying. Now, the way they died, obviously, was different. A number of Africans were killed in the process of the colonialists trying to basically enforce them into the slave trade. The second way in which they died was when they were transported across the Atlantic Ocean in these really, really harsh conditions. They didn't have access to food, didn't have access to water. They were basically suffering from diseases, and they weren't cared for whatsoever. Millions of people died on that journey alone. Finally, once they arrived in the American continent, they were worked to death on largely cotton plantations and other kind of enterprises. And the important thing that I would like us to remember about this process is its systematic character. Many of the people involved in this were not evil people. They didn't set out to be evil, but they accepted what they were doing because they had these elaborate ideologies of justification. And this is what is very worrying, is that really terrible things often happen with the best of intentions. The other thing I want us to remember is how this contributed to civilization. There's a sociologist at the University of Essex by the name of Robert Blackburn, who did a study of the relationship between the emergence of capitalism and industrialization and slavery. This was an old argument that people will still be debating now, but he argued that the profits of slavery between Europe, Africa, and America contributed fundamentally to Britain's industrialization. He said the profits from the trade for 1770 would have provided between 20 to 55% of Britain's gross fixed capital formation, which was then invested in industrialization. That is a very, very disturbing allegation, because it suggests, again, that violence, systematic violence, was somehow integral to our development, to our advancement. This is no less true than for the example of India. Again, not very well known, but there was a landmark study that was done by a British historian here by the name of Mike Davis, published in 2001, called Late Victorian Holocausts. And what he did, he showed how British imperial free market policies in India converted climatic events in South Asia, consisting of droughts, and also South Africa, into these really, really deadly famines. The droughts certainly would have led to deaths on a small scale. I think that's me. But it would not have led to this massive systematic scale of death. And he uses India as one of his prominent case studies, and he argues that between 5.5 and 12 million people died in what was essentially an artificially induced famine, where millions of tons of grain were actually in commercial circulation. He shows that India had basically become this satellite country for Britain's industrialization. Britain was industrializing. They needed to, most of the agricultural land was now being used for industry. So they needed to have more imports for food. And so India became basically the source of food. It fed England. And what he says is basically Londoners were in effect eating India's bread. Just to give you an example, between 1877 and 1878, grain merchants exported a record 6.4 million hundredweight of wheat to Europe, while millions of Indian poor starved to death. So Davis's conclusion is again very harrowing, very worrying. He says that these people didn't kind of die as some kind of accident of history. Many British officials knew what was going on. He goes through the documents. He gives quote after quote of officials, colonial administrators, justifying the mass death of Indians at that time. So he concludes that these people didn't die outside the modern world system. They died as part of the emergence of this world system. So my argument is that this violence was not merely accidental to the European imperial project. It was integral to it. And by that I don't mean that European settlers and colonists kind of set out to become murderous killers. Of course they didn't, by no means. As I said, many of them set out with the best of intentions, but in the course of their imperial projects, murderous killing became increasingly necessary if the interests of European colonies were to be sustained. When the natives increasingly resisted European interference to exert control over their lands, colonists responded with force. And this system basically accelerated between 1870 and 1914, when you've heard of the scramble for Africa, where there was a kind of renewed lease of life given to these colonial imperatives. During that period, almost the entire world essentially came under the control of the European empires. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, the USA, and Japan. Just as an example, between themselves in Africa, for example, they acquired 30 new colonies and 110 million subjects. I've given just one example there of how this impacted economically in a global scale. People talk about globalization. Globalization began in this process. It was a long historical process. It wasn't something that just began in the 1970s, as we're often kind of told. It was something that began many centuries ago. And this, we can see even features of it that we criticize now, we can see features of it going on then. And examples I gave there is per capita income for developed Europe compared to the colonies. In 1880, Europe